Shalon, proof of the Almighty's existence is in the very cities we live in. Look at the perfect symmetry.
Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for the Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth.
Hello, everyone. I'm Elle, and I will be the Ardent for today's episode as we cover Chapter 33, titled Cymatics from the Way of Kings.
I'm Adam, and I'm today's Worldsinger.
And I'm Liz. I'll be your Veristitalian.
So my Worldsinger for today doesn't quite connect to the theme, but it connects to a sentence from the chapter. And the sentence is when Shalon is describing the Palanaeum and describing kind of like the amazingness of being surrounded by all these books. And she says, quote, "One could disappear for hours in the Palanaeum and never see another soul," end quote. And I want to connect this to when I was at a little known school in upstate Boston called Harvard, or Harvarty if you prefer the cheese. And I worked at their rare books library, which is called Houghton. And the library system at Harvard is one of the most amazing things ever. I think it was my favorite thing about being there and what I always miss. Because they have about, I don't know, it was like 8 million books on campus and 8 million books off campus. And they just have these layers to the library where you can enter in to Widener, which is like the main library, and you're walking up these giant steps. You enter in, it's this giant entranceway. You walk through a little metal detector, and then in order to get back to the stacks, what you have to do is you have to take a left, and you go into this small little hallway, and you have to flash your ID and get it scanned, and you enter through this door, and you're still in this very tiny hallway because all of the stacks for Widener are all around the edges of the building. It's not like stacks in the regular library where it's just like row upon row upon row of bookcase. These are like on the edges, and then it has a little center area for the library itself. And you can walk into those little edges. And like these are industrial layered like bookshelves. They're not like the regular bookshelves that you put up in your room. Then you can walk back in there, and you can walk into the back and then go down some stairs and go down by about 3, 4, 5 flights into the bowels of this library. And for 12 hours, you can sometimes never see someone. You can just be surrounded by books. And then you can take secret little passageways between the libraries and then come up out of another library, and they're all like interconnected. And when I was working at Houghton, I was one of the carriers for the rare books. Like I got to hold the, first edition of Shakespeare's Folio. I got to touch the original copies of Emily Dickinson's poetry, really cool things like that. And it really is this space where you can disappear into the historical evidence of the past and only come up when, you're hungry, or only come up when you need some hot chocolate, since we're doing a Mormon podcast, or only come up when you need to, call your mom or something like that. And the way that Sanderson describes the Palanaeum is very connected in my brain to my experience at this giant library, and to my experience in any library, really, where it is, you get lost in the history, you get lost in the evidence of what is present there. If you're reading Sanderson and you've never been to one of these giant libraries, the way that he evokes it in the Palanaeum is definitely a connection to these big edifices of knowledge.
And I have today's Storm's Eye view, which goes thusly. Shalon ponders the structure and origin of the Palanaeum as she seeks a room deep within the library. She compares her broken Soulcaster to Yasna's, making sure the two are identical, and looks up the book Yasna was reading only to find it is a book of old folk tales. Shalon returns to her alcove to find Capsule waiting for her with bread and jam. They flirt and discuss the relative merits of a jam-based personality test, and the use of cymatic patterns as evidence for the Almighty. Yasna shows up and issues some sick burns, warning Shalon about Capsule's intentions.
All right. So one of the main points of this chapter is about Capsule attempting to give Shalon evidence of the Almighty's existence. And this is interesting, given what we know that Capsule is a member of the Ghost Bloods. and is actually trying to kill Jasna. So his motivations are a little unclear because it's not super obvious. He's not actually an Ardent, so it's not obvious that like he should be part of the Ardentia or like that he cares about Shallan's soul or Jasna's soul. And yet he seems very excited about this idea of sharing these things, which makes me think that like, you know, the ghost builds are all different. That like he does very much believe in a god, and this is convincing to him, these cymatic patterns. So I wanted to start with a Mormon moment, which comes again, second episode in a row, a story from the Book of Mormon. But this time we're jumping further in time from Nephi to the middle of the Book of Mormon in a book called Alma. And the story is kind of based in Alma chapter 30, where we have a man named Korihor who is a missionary for the atheism, I guess is the best way to say that. He's called an antichrist in the book. But this chapter is a conversation between Alma and Korihor and evidence of God.
I think what you mean is Korihor is an online troll. But in this chapter, they have this back and forth in this talk. And I think, if I remember correctly, Korihor is trained to be a lawyer-like person or trained in some forms of rhetoric and argument. And so he's able to hold his own against Alma, who is the high priest of the church, right? He's the OG, the actual guy who like formed this church and is like, I know all this doctrine. It is my doctrine, basically. Even though it's God's doctrine, like put it up to the big man. And when... In the chapter, so in chapter 30, verses specifically 43 and 44, and I'm going to read Korihor's like question or his provocation, and then Alma's response, and then after that, I'm going to hand it over to Liz to kind of connect it back to the Shallan moment here, so that we can all have a conversation around it. And so for chapter 30, verse 43, it says, And now Korihor said unto Alma, If thou wilt show me a sign, that I may be convinced that there is a God, yea, show unto me that he hath power, and then will I be convinced of the truth of thy words. So he's showing forth, you know, the question that every single questioner, every single person who, you know, is asked to engage with God, that question of like, if God can just show me that God's there, I'll be good. Like, just give me a sign. To which Alma responds, but Alma said unto him, Thou hast had signs enough. Will ye tempt your God? Will ye say, Show unto me a sign, when ye have the testimony of all these thy brethren, and also all the holy prophets? The scriptures are laid before thee, yea, and all things denote there is a God, yea, even the earth, and all things that are upon the face of it, yea, and its motion, yea, and also all the planets which move in their regular form do witness that there is a supreme creator. So Alma's response to Korihor is, look around you, bub. It's the fact that you're here. It's the uniqueness of your existence in this entirety of this massive amount of galaxies that you exist as a human being. That denotes there is a God. And that is the sign, is what Alma answers Korihor with.
And to me, like, reading this conversation between Capsule and Shallan really, like, called to mind that moment, because it is the same kind of argument of, like, appeal to the orderliness of nature and saying, like, that can't be a coincidence, which you may or may not find convincing. There's arguments on both sides that are really interesting. But I think the rhetorical way that Capsule approaches this is very reminiscent of the argument Alma is making there, saying, like, just look at, like, the way the world works, the way that everything is so orderly. And so that proves that God exists, which it doesn't. Like, I don't think there's anything that can definitively prove in this kind of evidentiary way. And we see Shallan pushing back on that a little bit in a way that, like, Korihor doesn't necessarily. But her making some of the arguments that we would expect people to push back against that, to be like, well, symmetry can be created in other ways, and it could be a false correlation. Like, one of the common ways we see this argument come up nowadays is this argument to the constants of the universe. Like, if if the various like constants of gravity and the speed of light and all of these were tuned slightly differently, life would be impossible, and therefore God must exist. But is that a false correlation saying, well, if we exist because those are tuned that way? And so, these arguments go round and round.
I'd say always that, like, for me, growing up in the church, I always struggled with this type of argument, especially when it's just like kind of like forced down my throat, where it's like, yeah, God exists. Look at everything around you. And it's like, okay, like, I'm a little bit more sold in the Book of Mormon when Alma, I think it's Alma who walks through the whole, like, if all of this wasn't here, God would cease to exist type of argument myself. Or at least that's what convinced me when I was younger. I don't think it's convincing to me now, but I think it's an interesting response. And you can tell in the Book of Mormon that Alma's a little frustrated with Korihor. He's frustrated with like what he's doing to undermine everything. And you can say that there's this very personal tension of Alma. And it, as Liz was saying, and I'll just like add second testimony to it. It's not a good proof of God per se. Like, I don't think it's as convincing as people sometimes want it to be. It's not as convincing as I think Alma wanted it to be, because it definitely didn't convince Korihor. He needed that sign to ultimately be struck dumb, and then like wasn't he like trodden over by people? In the same way that a bear comes out of
Yes, things don't go well for Korihor.
No. But like, I don't know, I agree with that sense. And it's like the same thing that comes up in this chapter, where it's like, I don't really agree that all these scientific things equal godliness, like equal the tantamount existence of God is because science works.
Yeah. It is interesting because in a Rosharan context, we know within the world, like, or within words of Brandon, that like Adonalsium specially formed Roshar to have lots of resonances with music and with numerology. And so in this case, like, actually, it is true that like these cities probably were formed via cymatics, because, we have people who can liquefy the ground and we have the various tones of Roshar. So it's kind of ironic that like Capsule, we know, doesn't have great motivations, isn't really an Ardent. So like what's his deal here? B, our main character Shallan, who's like one of our more like faithful and Vorin kind of people. She's not as questioning as, say, Yasna or Kaladin or Dalinar, who's like trying to reform the whole system. She's the one pushing back against this argument. And then C, we know maybe it's accurate to the in-world cosmology, that like these actually are signs of like the way Adonalsium designed Roshar to be. So just really interesting mixed signals going on in this chapter.
I think something that's interesting to point out in Alma chapter 30, verse 40, Alma says to Korihor, "And now what evidence have ye that there is no God? I say unto you that you have none, save it be your word only." So the theme, if you haven't already guessed, for this chapter is evidence. And kind of going back and forth on, well, can you have any evidence that a null hypothesis exists? Can you have evidence that a God exists? Like, both people, because you're dealing with something that's like, I would say in our world, much more abstract. In Rosharan world, or like in the Cosmere, I feel like gods feel a little bit more concrete and like they do literally exist. I don't know what that's like for a lived experience, but like obviously Yasna is an atheist versus Shallan, who's a devout believer. But it is interesting that we have Shallan being positioned as one of our most devoted people, being like questioning the evidence of God that Capsule is presenting in a scientific way. And I think it's valuable to have the devoted one be like, you are presenting this as a proof, but that's not what's actually convincing me to believe in God. What is evidence for Shallan, kind of going back on one of the last episodes we talked about with Shallan, the evidence for her was her feelings, not the scientific proof of things.
And I think this is one of the things I really like about the way Sanderson uses religion in his books, is because he is someone who is a believer, who's an active member of a religion. He's also able to push back and say, just because like this is an argument that supports my side doesn't mean it's a good argument. and I should allow it to stand. And I think that's always a rhetorical temptation, is like, well, this supports my point, so I'm going to ignore all of the like negatives to this evidence because it's on my side. And I think on any issue, that's problematic when we are willing to have that confirmation bias and be like, great, you say this supports the side I already was inclined to agree with, so I'm going to accept your evidence. So he's able to do that.
The parallel with that is the conversation they have about jams as a personality test, where Shallan is like, well, I like Simberry jam, and this is what I am like according to this book. And she's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And that's like a way scaled down like thing where it's like Simberry jam is evidence of this personality. It's like lower stakes than like, is there a God?
I think one thing that for me complicates the question with Sanderson and evidence and belief is that, like, for Kabzal, he's trying to argue that this is evidence for the Almighty, even though the Almighty is basically the Stormfather, who is not Honor, who is not Adonalsium. And the complexity of this is the multiplicity of gods, which I think is always the complicatedness when it comes to trying to convert someone to a view of God or toward a certain religion. And it's something that came up a lot in my thinking when I was a missionary, was I'm trying to help you convert. I'm trying to, open up a pathway for you to get to God, to get to this religion and conversation of that. But it's also a sense that every single person has a different view of God. So it's, if the evidence works for you, but it doesn't work for me, that doesn't make either of them wrong. It doesn't make either of them right, because of the complexity of what God is, right? Because we can never have that full proof of God right in front of us. We're not Joseph Smith. We're not other people who have seen God in their lives or have claimed to see God in their lives, right? Like, I don't think anyone in this podcast has seen God. If you have, that's cool. You don't need to share unless you want to. But each of us, like even just in this podcast, right? Elle, Liz, me, think of God differently. We view God differently. And I think that's one of the cool things that come out in this chapter is how Shallan views God differently than Kabzal. And it's not like a very like clear in the conversation. I mean, you can tell that what's guiding them to it based on the previous chapter with Shallan and Teravangian and Jasnah talking through theology is that you come to God through different ways and God looks like different things to you. And for the in-worldness here, for me, what is comforting is that there is a multiplicity of godliness, right? Even in the Almighty being the Stormfather, being what's his name? Jezreza? Being the Herald King.
Jezrien,
that's I'm like, Jesrim, that's not it. No, it starts with a J and has a Z in there. But what you see as God is how you sometimes describe the evidence to get to God in order to prove your point. And I think that comes out clear here, where for Kabzal, the evidence is in the science. For Shallan, the evidence is in the feeling. But it's also the question of, do they both see God the same way? Is Shallan's Almighty the same as Kabzal's Almighty? Which is not the same as Adonalsiam, who created Roshar, right? And so it's like, when we say this is evidence for God, what God is it evidence of? Or whose God? Or what view of God is it evidence of?
I think that's interesting with like reflecting back on Jasnah's idea of morality. She doesn't feel like the Almighty sets her morality. And to her, the point of what it seems to be based on the conversation with Teravangian, the point of a God is to set morality. And if she doesn't think a God sets morality, then there's no point in having a God. And so Jasnah's view is like, the way she sees God becomes evidence for there not being a God. Or for there being a God for Teravangian, who feels that morality is set by God. But I think like your point of like, well, if it's Adonalsium setting the morality, does Jasnah, is that like too abstracted for Jasnah to like be able to agree whether or not there is a God? Especially like Dalinar ends up causing this whole to-do because he's like, the Almighty is dead, but it's just Honor, who is a shard of a greater power. And even Dalinar insists, well, I think there is still a God. I feel evidence of a God, but it's a God beyond the shard.
And we have several examples in the chapter where people, because of their perspective, misinterpret the evidence, right? Shalon especially, like, believes Capsule just wants to hang out with her and is flirting with her. And she interprets this evidence that you keep showing up with bread and jam to hang out with me in one way. And Yasna interprets it in a different way because she knows, like, her experience with the Ghost Bloods, and, like, she doesn't trust Ardent or anyone who's trying to spend too much time with her, probably. And so, like, the fact that, like, it's the same evidence, the Capsule keeps showing up with bread and jam, but because of past experience, because of their inclinations, they're interpreting it differently.
We get that with the way that, like, Shalon looks at Yasna's work. Like, Shalon sees this book of folktales and is like, well, how is this anything useful? Whereas Yasna is reading it and seeing it as, like, almost more historical, because, like, there is a way that fairy tales and folktales can pass on truths that don't get passed on the same way in history.
And I read this to be really interesting because I know that Sanderson took a folklore class at BYU. I've actually read his capstone project for that class, which was on D&D folklore. But so we've got, like, this character, and who's, like, using folklore to find history, which is not the way that real folklorists work, but it's often the way folklorists work in fantasy stories. But it's ironic that Yasna shows up at the end and Capsule tells her, your hero is a fable. And she's like, oh, you should be used to believing in fables. But she's the one who's actually believing in the fables and the folk tales because she's actually trying to find Eurothiru. So just fascinating.
I think two things to take from our conversation here, from brief section with Shalon's and the bowels of the Palaneum. First, I think her question about the stories is really interesting. So at the very end of that section, in the penultimate paragraph, she asks, what kind of truth could she, Yasna, find in stories told to frighten, disobedient, dark-eyed children? I think that separation and that analysis of evidence is really interesting, right? Because there are pieces of evidence. I mean, if we're broadening this a little bit into, like, thinking academically about evidence, there are layers to a historiography and to a historical approach to evidence that occur. So, for example, a lot of historians used to be to pull from, like, census data and all that type of data, and they ignored, like, women's journals as being true historical accounts of what they were saying. And then, like, in Mormon studies, at least, we had nice little Laurel Thatcher Ulrich and all of them who, like, engaged in this idea of women's journals as being evidentiarily efficacious to the work of describing and building out history. So I think it's really interesting that Shalon is dismissive of them, not as fairy tales, but as stories told to this underclass of citizen. And why is the upper class light-eyed woman looking at these dark-eyed stories that are just there to frighten them into obedience? So they're not even stories that are there to frighten light eyes into obedience, right? They're stories to frighten dark eyes. And I think that layer of shows Shalon's ineptitude as, like, a scholar, of course, but also adds this tension where, for evidence, it really connects to where your evidence is coming from and the different layers and norms of that evidence as well. And the other thing I wanted to briefly pull us to is a little earlier in the chapter when is tying back into our conversation about how evidence changes and how evidence should change our view of people and things. And she's talking about Yasna, and it says, Yasna had seemed acceptable when the princess had been a distant, unknown figure, a heretic, presumably ill-tempered and demanding. But what of the real Yasna? A careful scholar, stern but fair, with a surprising level of wisdom and insight. Could Shalon really steal from her? And it's interesting because Shalon's getting these different evidentiary moments with Yasna, with Capsule, and the way that she reads them is a very teen girl trying to figure out her life type of thing. She's definitely not in her 30s yet. She's not, like, arrived into whatever this part of our life is. But at the same time, she's learning and developing and reassessing according to the evidence. And I think that is such a key thing when it comes to thinking through our theme of evidence, is how evidence doesn't just prove something. Evidence needs to be used to prove something. And it's that use part that I think is really interesting and applicable to our lives, right? Where it's like, how do we use evidence? Evidence isn't just equal, there is a God. It's evidence used to think through how God is a God. And that middle part there of the use of evidence, the stories of evidence, is something that I think comes out in this chapter really well.
I wanted to bring up some evidence, by the way, for something that I did not notice until I reread this chapter. At the bottom of that page you were just quoting from, Shallan is in this room all by herself, and then all of a sudden, figure shows up, an old be-robed female Ardent shuffling with a lantern and followed by a parshman. And then at the end of the paragraph it said, it looked as if one of the heralds themselves was walking through the stacks. And we know that there is a female, older herald hanging out in Kharbranth with Taravangian. So I think this is my evidence that this is Batar here, showing up in this chapter. There you go, where we're talking about the existence of the Almighty and the heralds. So fascinating there. Secret heralds.
And this is a Batar stan. At least I am. You get your mercenary, let's murder all the other people.
She's such an interesting herald, and we'll have to talk about it when we get to more herald stuff. But I love what Sanderson's doing with the heralds.
Kind of similar to that. We're not going to talk about glories and callings from a Mormon perspective in this episode. But I was looking into a little bit more. And the way that they're described on the Coppermind is that for Vorinism, as a mark of achievement when someone's goals have been reached, a person can elevate and reach points in their calling and glory. Doing so requires the presence of an Ardent and presumably some kind of evaluation, such as a test of this person's abilities. And to me, that felt like evidence of Vorinism's roots in the Radiant Oaths. This idea of you need to reach a certain point where you have achieved a goal. You say an oath and unlock the next level of whatever. But this is their way of integrating Radiant Oaths into their regular religion for regular people. Because we see the Light Eyes, they have a position of dominance because of the Radiance. And Hoyd mentions it's a stupid system, but it makes sense. There is some reasoning behind it, but there are these little bits of evidence of how Radiants have influenced the culture, even if they've been gone from it for so long.
Which kind of ties back to Jasnah's use of folklore, right, to try to discover history. And it's really interesting that this is a common way scholars still look down on folklore. Folklore is kind of a backwater of scholarship in many ways because people do dismiss it as just children's stories or just stories that gullible people tell and we can't seriously take anything from them. I just finished reading a new scholarly book on Mormon folklore on the 3 Nephites, which we'll have to talk about some other time. But it spends a lot of time talking about this. The point of this is not to say, oh, were the 3 Nephites really there, and try to pin this down, this Mormon folklore thing. But to say, why do people tell these stories, and what does that say about the people who are telling them? And that's kind of the way that Jasnah's using them and saying, she's noticing common themes. People are talking about Voidbringers in this way, and what can we infer about what they thought about Voidbringers originally and who they might have been from this. And so not dismissing people's supernatural beliefs because we're concerned about truth value of the stories, but using those to say, okay, if you continue to tell these kind of supernatural stories that put emphasis on certain aspects, what does that say about what this culture values? And that's a totally different way to approach the meaning and truth of a religion than the way that Cabsel's trying to approach truth and let's just establish if it's true or not. He's kind of the opposite way that he's has the same approach as Jasnah, but opposite conclusions. Whereas the approach of looking at folklore is okay, let's set aside whether this story really happened or not and see what we can learn from the story about what these people value and what they're like, which is, I think, a healthier approach to studying religion in general.
This is kind of what I really like corpus linguistics, is it approaches language from a perspective of what can we know about this text from like taking a step back and looking at like what is it telling us that people aren't necessarily conscious of how they're telling us. And it's been really interesting to use corpus linguistics to look at Mormon studies, to look at trends in how different things are talked about in different mediums, and like to give evidence for other trends that you might see in how Mormon society and Mormon culture changes in the text, because you can get evidence in a different sort of way.
I think that for me pulls to area that I really highlighted when I was thinking through the theme of evidence, which is at the very end of the conversation between Shalon and Kabzeel. Yasta is about to appear. They hear footsteps. Kabzeel has said, don't forget that all of the things around us denote the Almighty and denote this idea. All the symmetrical things are really interesting, no matter what Yasta says. And then Shalon says, I won't. And then she says, realizing how he'd guided the conversation. He'd said he believed her, but still he'd gone through his proofs. It was touching and annoying at the same time. She did not like his the condescension. But then could anyone really blame an Ardent for preaching? And what really stuck out to me was that realizing how he'd guided the conversation when thinking about evidence and thinking about how like evidence itself is a story. So there's in the feminist studies a lot, there are always counter stories and counter narratives to the hegemonic, patriarchal, norm setting stories, right? And that's always what feminist studies is really trying to do, is to pull out the contrary telling, not to dismiss the evidence per se, but to ask, how are we telling a story in a specific way? And for feminism, they usually look at like power, gender, sex, etc., right? And this made me think about, how do we guide our conversations? How do we guide the evidence? Instead of just presenting evidence, right? Evidence is always there to help support us. And again, it always makes me think through conversion and missionary stories and think about that connection, and that there's a discomfort here for Shalon, right? Of course, she explains it away by him being an Ardent and preaching, but there's still a discomfort in that realization of like, this person was guiding me towards something rather than just us talking about it. And for me, that always makes me question and think through how evidence is presented and the stories we tell around it.
I think what Shalon feels most bothered by is that it feels condescending, that there was a moment of like, yeah, I trust that you're not going to change your mind. And then going ahead and trying to like make sure she was extra convinced anyways, when sometimes I think Shalon like has these conversations with Yasna where Yasna is presenting evidence, but it doesn't feel like it's an attempt to inherently persuade Shalon or to do so like in a way to convince her otherwise. And I think that like as part of presenting evidence, it's not just like how you do it, but like the context in which you're doing it. Like Shalon didn't actually need to have evidence presented to her and didn't want to be preached to. She was like, I'm secure in my own religious beliefs. I don't need you to walk me through this again. And the fact that you're doing that makes me feel like you don't trust me to like be true to what you're saying. Okay. So we're going to try another new sacred reading method. Last year, the LDS Church released a guide to various scripture study skills. And I would say these tend to be Mormon sacred reading methods. And so we're probably going to start pulling these out now that we have rediscovered that this exists, because somehow we completely missed it. The church is sometimes not good at publishing when they have released things. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are not. They were not good about announcing this one. So what we are going to do is we are going to use the method of symbolism, or identifying symbols, and specifically looking at the broken Soulcaster as a symbol in this chapter. And to kind of guide this, I want us to kind of think about, are there any deliberate comparisons that are made like within this chapter, the broken Soulcaster, to something? And then just like questioning whether or not the Soulcaster is or can be a symbol of anything. And if it does, or does that actually add something to the chapter? Or does it impact how we can understand Shallan better, or whatever the Soulcaster is compared to? Does it impact us to look at the Soulcaster as a symbol?
I think it's interesting to look at Shallan comparing this broken Soulcaster to the functional Soulcaster, and we know that there's a big difference between the two. One is alive and a real spren, and one is dead spren. And can they even be repaired is an interesting question. But what that makes me think of is like things that appear the same on the outside, but are, one can be dead on the inside and one can be alive on the inside. And thinking about that in relation to the rest of the chapter, and the idea of Capsule presenting these arguments for the truth of, you know, his beliefs, but they don't seem to appeal to Shallan. They feel pretty dead inside. And so just the way that like evidence can sometimes be enlivened by something because it has to do with a personal experience, or it can be more dead and like, I don't connect with this evidence. Kind of like Adam was talking about earlier about it's about your personal connection. Because like the way I connect to the scripture we've talked about from Alma is that like it's more about the awe of experiencing nature than like this could not exist without God. I don't find that argument as convincing as the like the awe and the sort of feelings you get from it. And so like the alive and dead ways of looking at different kinds of evidence, even though they appear similar from the outside. I don't know. That's my attempt.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think like the clarification I would make is I think Shallan's, as far as we know, was an actual Soulcaster, which is like a sleeping kind of spren. And then Yasna's is just jewelry because it's not ivory. Like ivory, she doesn't use that Soulcaster to do the soulcasting.
Good point.
I think your metaphor still stands. I think it's like that Yasna's is the dead one because it's just jewelry, and the like broken one is the alive-ish one because it's sleeping in an actual spren.
It's interesting. There's like multiple layers there of like which one is the actual broken one, because Shallan's actually worked at one point and the Yasna's never does. That's fascinating.
Well, I also think that like any Soulcaster is a little broken at the end of the day, right? The captured spren. So it's not how Soulcasting is technically meant to work per se. It's not through the Nile bond. It's not through that, like, I don't want to call it correct way, but like that more natural way per se. Like it's a attempt to replicate something that naturally occurs in that formation of that bond for light weavers and all scholars, right? And so I think thinking of Soulcasters in relation to being broken, you could consider all of them as technically adaptation, at least, of something that was lost, or as like a creation in order to solve a problem like that. And I think to think about that in relation to the chapter, there are a few ways that we could go with it, but the two ways that I'm thinking right now are the brokenness that it takes for a Knight Radiant to make it back to being like, or not back, to make it to being a level 5 Radiant, right? They have to be very broken to have their soul entirely fixed by the oaths, right? And so both Shallan and Yasna here are both very broken because they're on a pathway to fix themselves through forming those oaths and through responding to those ideals. And the other thing I wanted to think through was about the placement of the cities onto the cymatic landscapes, and how that is a way of like responding to a naturalness with something that is human made, which is, I think, what a Soulcaster really is doing, right? It's a human made version of this bond that is also human made in some ways, but I think it's a little more ethereal than the Soulcaster. And so for me, the symbolism of the broken Soulcaster is thinking through how those who do Soulcast are broken already, but also the Soulcasters themselves are always broken in some form.
And that becomes explicit when Boraes says, like, your family owes us a broken Soulcaster, and then is implying that Shallan is the broken Soulcaster that the Ghost Bloods are using. And I think that, like, that comparison, when I was re-listening to Words of Radiance, it just, like, really stuck out to me of Shallan as the broken Soulcaster. And her being broken emotionally, but she's also very much being treated as a thing by the Ghostblood. She's not being treated as a person. She is a thing to them to manipulate and to use to accomplish their goals. And it's interesting because, like, the Soulcasters, like, the physical item is a spren that, like, their people are using to accomplish their goals without treating it as in, like, as a sapient spren who has ideas and cognition that it's not being used.
Well, then there's also the layer of, like, the Soulcasters themselves, like the human version using the what are the Soulcasters actually called?
Both called Soulcasters, because Rosharans like to use the same word for as many things as possible.
No, but what's the word for the actual Soulcaster mechanism? Like those mechanisms that use Spren to do things? I forget what the term is.
Fabrial.
Fabrial, yeah. So they're fabricated fabrials. But so it's the Fabrial, right? And then you have the Soulcaster who is doing the Soulcaster, who is also viewed as a thing outside of society, right? But add on to the layer of that where a Soulcaster is someone who has to have such a strong will that they're able to exert that will over something else to make it change from what it, spiritually believes it is into something different. And it's like, that is such power in something that is so ostracized from society that I think is another fascinating layer to the symbolism, right? It's these things that are shunned, these things that are put off to the side. Your entire body starts changing if you're not doing it through the Nile bond protections. But in order to do this thing, in order to turn stone into smoke, in order to turn a twig into fire, but I am a stick, you have to have such a strong will over that thing. You have to have such a strong sense of self over and in relation to that thing, right? In order to make it change, in order to bring that power with you, even as your society and your community rejects you, which I think is another interesting layer to this.
Also fascinating considering, like, how Shallan doesn't have that sense of self. She has a sense of many selves and doesn't know which one is her a lot of the time. And so it is, I do think it's a really interesting symbol for Shallan because we have this Soulcaster that looks completely fixed on the outside. And Shallan is really good at pretending to be fine, right? And looking fine from the outside. But, underneath being very, like, non-functional and not being able to deal with all of these traumatic things in her past and just having to suppress those instead of, like, actually work through them. Similar to the Soulcaster looks great. It doesn't work yet, even though it looks good.
I think it's interesting too to think about Jasna in that, like, we don't know enough about, like, her backstory. We see hints of it, but, like, she always seems put together. She's, like, always, like, poised. She's always got her hair and makeup and clothes together. Shallan is constantly admiring her to the point where Shallan's now bisexual. And, like, it's interesting that, like, we don't see Jasna's brokenness. Like, Shallan only sees the unbroken Soulcaster in Jasna. But, like, and, like, we as readers kind of only see the unbroken Jasna. And so I'm really curious to see the back half to see, like, what happened to Jasna. How was she able to, like, repair herself or with the help of Ivory to create those repairs to be a less broken internally Soulcaster?
It's because Jasna is perfect. Full stop.
Adam, as our eternal advocate for Jasna, it's perfection.
But I mean, the symbol of the broken Soulcaster does appear right next to that description where Shallan's reevaluating how she saw Yasna. And even now, she still doesn't see what she sees in, Words of Radiance, that like Yasna's worried about stuff. And then what she sees in is it Oathbringer or Words of Radiance where Yasna shows up again? Oathbringer. She shows up again and she's like, actually, I disagree with Yasna a lot of the time. And she's kind of, putting me down and I don't like that. And so like her image of Yasna continues to evolve as she interacts with her and realizes she's not just a perfect soulcaster, but that she has her own quirks and things that she's working through as well.
And I think this comes out of like what is so general about Soulcaster is that changingness of it, that power to change. Like that of all the surges, I think is the most personal and the most like influential on other things, right? Like Windrunners, they can kind of like move some things together and stick some things there. Skybreakers can fall upward. Cool. But it's like they're not doing anything that like actually like affects entirely someone else. They're just shifting things. Whereas the Soulcaster is all about changing. It's all about transformation. It's all about that sense of becoming something else. And I mean, even like thinking through like regrowth or something, right? Regrowth is still regrowing or healing yourself, but it's still yourself. You're not transforming into something different, which is why I think in Shallan, we get such a growth character, right? Where by the end of the entire 5 books, she's a very different Shallan than she was on the boat when we first meet her, right? And in that sense of change is so powerful because of that relationship to what change does, what transformation does, is it is exerting a will over something else. It is taking on the responsibility to exert that will and the consequence of asserting that will.
And I think that kind of goes back to the point you were making, Adam, about like the soulcasters need a strong sense of self in order to like affect these changes. And I think that like in our own lives, what we need is to like know how we want to change to actually like make changes, because otherwise you can like drift into changes, but like an active process of making changes means knowing what you want for yourself and what you want your self to be and to become, more than just letting it happen to you. All right. So we're going to conclude now with our Wisdom of the Herald, where we each talk about something that we want to bring from this episode into our personal lives.
I'm going to hop on to what I was saying at the end, the last section of the podcast, and that sense of like, you need to know what you need to change in order to change it. You need to have a sense of what that change will bring about in order to do it. And I want to have in my life a little bit more recognition of what is required to change and acknowledgement of the consequences of that change and that willpower to see that change through. Right. To be able to, start that habit of going to the gym or whatever, or to not have 5 breakdowns every semester or something like that. Right. Like a sense of like, I want to see the change and I want to be able to take myself through that change.
I think kind of similarly to that, I want to like cultivate a better sense of self, of knowing or having a better understanding of what kind of person I want to be. I think kind of in relation to the previous episode where we were talking about qualms and this idea of like not a competition, but a conflict between like a duty and responsibility to community and other things that are going on. I feel like having a sense of self, a better sense of self, will help like not necessarily reduce those qualms, but make it easier to navigate those qualms and experiences, because I have a better like value compass of what I personally am looking for. I don't know how to do that yet, but that's what I'm thinking about.
And I think my takeaway is that I want to spend more time listening to other people's religious experiences and what evidence appeals to them. I think that was a really good insight that we had, that a lot of the time what counts as like religiously good evidence depends on what kind of person we are. And the only way to step outside of our own box of like what appeals to us is to listen to more people and find out how they experience these phenomena in the world that we experience in a certain way. So just spending more time talking to people about what is appealing to them about their beliefs and how they came to that perspective, and not framing it in terms of what I personally find appealing or what I personally find convincing. Thank you for joining us today on The Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination.